Well, it's time for more fun with Fractal Design, this time with the Core 1100 series Micro ATX Tower Case. Hello everybody and welcome to Tech Uploaded. I'm Chris as always, and like I said today, I'm taking a look at the fairly entry-level Core 1100 series case from Fractal Design. Now, the reason that I have this particular case is I actually put in a request for a review sample back before I did the budget gaming builds when I was still in planning. But some time went by and review samples weren't ready yet, so I ended up going with what I found to be a really good deal. I think I paid like around $35 or $40-ish for those SPEC-01 cases. And as you know, you kind of get what you pay for. The build experience in those was not the most pleasant thing in the world. They look okay when you're done, and so far they've been great, but it's going to be very nice to be able to compare that with what you get by stepping up just a little bit and going with the good old Fractal Design Core series. So we'll see how this case shakes out. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the outside and the inside of this Micro ATX case, and then we'll go ahead and throw in the parts from the AMD budget gaming build and see how this compares. Okay, first things first, taking a look at the box, you can see that it did get damaged a little bit during shipping, but I don't think it did any damage to the case. As you can see, the hard foam is visible through, but it doesn't look like it took any damage. And of course, with this being a budget case, the case foam included is the hard foam, so once it's damaged for good, and it's gonna crack. So if you're shipping this back out, that is something to keep in mind if you're a system builder. All right, so taking a look at the exterior of the case, you can see that it does have this nice brushed aluminum look on the front panel with a little bit of like a three-dimensional textured finish, especially with the little side vents that you can see going along both sides that are at a little bit of an angle there for a nice aesthetic touch. And then you do have the easy I/O front panel. So with that one, you've got one USB 3.0, a USB 2.0, audio in and out, and of course your power button with LED, which will be white, and the hard drive activity LED, which is also white. You can see that the panels are fairly nondescript. This is a non-windowed version of this case, so you do have a fan inlet on the left side. This is if you're facing the case, and then the other side panel for the right is pretty much plain Jane. You got a little bit of an indent there, so you can grab onto the door to pull it off after you remove the thumb screws for the side panels, and you get that on the other side as well. But that's about it. Really nondescript, to be expected for a budget case. And then taking a look at the back of the case, you can see that you do have your 4 expansion slots, and then you do have an area to put a fan, which I'll go into cooling details a little bit more in a minute. And of course, your power supply mounting area is at the top, which is a little bit unique for this case. And taking a look at the inside, you can see that you do have screw holes on here to put standoffs for a mini ITX or a micro ATX motherboard, which is always nice for some flexibility. Now for the drive base, this is where things get a little bit interesting in this case. You do have your standard 2 5¼ inch bays up at the top, which is nothing new, but they're using kind of an innovative design here with this vertical hard drive bracket. So this thing can hold 2 3.5 inch drives, or 3 2.5 inch drives, or 1 drive of each size. So you can see there's little rubber feet on these, so they are vibration dampened by using those for the 3.5 inch mechanical drives. Now back to those expansion slots, that they do support graphics cards up to 350 millimeters in length, but 1 or more 3.5 inch hard drives may interfere with side-mounted power connections for graphics cards that are longer than 170 millimeters, so keep that in mind. Now as far as PSUs are concerned on this is a fairly small case, so you may be wondering, how much can you fit? Well, 185 millimeters if a typical length optical drive is mounted. So not too bad considering how compact things are in here. Now, one thing to keep in mind, there's no grommets in the back as you noticed on this case. So there's really no cable management to be had on the rear. And taking a look at the rear, you can see there's no space back here whatsoever to really be able to do any routing, especially with these little bump outs right here. So every cable you put in this system is going to be visible. So keep that in mind if you're going for a really long power supply. You gotta have room to put those cables somewhere. So my recommendation would be, and we'll see when I do the build, but I would probably put the optical drive 1 down maybe and try to tuck some cables up above it. I don't know, we'll see. And in case you're wondering, the case dimensions are 175 millimeters wide, 358 millimeters high, and 410 millimeters deep. And the thing comes in with nothing inside of it at 3.8 kilograms. Now this case does have support for 3 fans. You do get 1 included, and that is in the front. That's the Fractal Design silent 120 millimeter fan, which is fixed at 1200 RPMs if you're just plugging directly into a Molex or something. If you do go with the motherboard header, obviously you have a little bit more control on that. And the side is also a 120 millimeter fan, which does not come included, and the rear is a 92 millimeter mount. So I always, I got a 92 millimeter fan in for review, and I thought, what do you do with one of these? Well, now I know I've got a case that takes one. So keep that in mind, a little bit of an odd size for that rear fan. And then you do get the standard accessory box included as well, which is a little bit interesting because it's a fairly large box with just one little bag in it. And that's got all of your standoffs that you're going to need for doing your motherboard mounts, depending on which option you go with, mini ITX or micro ATX, and then all of the miscellaneous screws that you'll need. So overall, pretty straightforward case, not a whole lot to really look at here. It looks like it should be a pretty simple build. I'm a little bit concerned about the cable management, but not too much. So now it's time to take the components from the AMD budget gaming build, throw them in here, and see how things work out. Well, as you can see, the build is finished and everything did fit, but boy did it just barely. This is a very small case, and I was trying to pack quite a bit in there. Now, as far as the positives go, I think it's a good looking case, it's compact, and overall the build experience was pretty positive. I didn't run into a lot of the issues that I did with the Corsair SPEC-01, where I had a hard time getting screws along the top for the motherboard and really had to switch screwdrivers and do some finagling. I didn't run into any of that, but some of the cons. This case is small. You cannot route cables along the back. There's no cable management option, so everything is in plain view, basically, right in the front. Now, this case does not have a windowed side panel, so that's not a huge deal, but you have to be really careful that you don't have cables running into the fan in the front or onto the CPU cooler. The other issue, while this case is about the same size, it's a little bit smaller than the SPEC-01, it doesn't have a side panel that bumps out, which means you're limited to CPU coolers that are 148 millimeters high. So that means I couldn't use the Hyper 212 Evo, which just barely fit in the Corsair case, so I knew that it wasn't going to fit in this one, but I do prefer the overall simpler look of this case. I think it's just cleaner overall. Another issue I had was with the weird hard drive mounting mechanism. I understand why they did it because it saves some space, but the 3.5-inch drive, if I would have mounted it in the bottom, it wouldn't have fit, period. It would have bumped into the front fan. And putting it in the top still was pretty darn close. I had to force it in, and it's touching the fan. I mean, it's really squeezed up against the fan. So it fit, but it barely fit. And if you're going to use this case, I highly recommend that you get your hands on some SATA cables that are straight on both sides. The right angle I had on my SATA cable made it so I had to really bend that cable so that it would fit, and the front panel pushes on it, and it's kind of unnerving, but what are you gonna do? Those were the cables I had, and they did work, but they, again, very tight fit. Same goes for the SATA power connection cables. They also had to be kind of, finagled in a way that was a little bit uncomfortable because of the way they just, the way they mount, and they come out, and when you're doing more than one, you're coming in one side, going into the drive, and then coming out, and you have to really bend it to get it to make it around that. So when I put the side panel on, I actually had to lay the case on its side, push it down and use a little bit of force and then slide it in. But that said, it did fit, and I didn't have to put an unnerving amount of force in place to do so. Installing the expansion card was no problem with the GPU that I selected for this one. I went with the 270X, and that fit just fine. It wasn't too long. I did have to make sure that I plugged in the auxiliary power to it, the 6-pin cable, before I put the hard drive bracket back in place. Otherwise, it would have been a little bit difficult to get to it. I do see what Fractal warns about with, especially the hard drive placement. If you had more than one 3.5-inch drive and you had a long GPU that you're trying to put in here, you would definitely have a clearance issue. So anything a whole lot longer than that 270 would make me a little bit uncomfortable unless you were using like a dual SSD setup. But even then, I feel like the cables might be an issue for you. So, just keep in mind, this is a small case. Don't try to cram, really big GPUs in here or anything like that. Airflow, I don't think is going to be too much of an issue. Like I said, I'm going to get the stock cooler back in here, so I'm probably going to pull the overclock off of this chip. And there is some ventilation on the side for some air to come into the GPU area, and you do have room to put a fan in there if things are heating up too much. And the front fan should keep things moving, moving along nicely. However, there are a lot of cables sitting in front of that fan, so it is going to restrict some of the airflow. So at the end of the day, would I select this case, the Fractal Core 1100, over the SPEC-01 from Corsair for my budget gaming builds if I had it to do again? I think I would. It would still be a little bit of a tough decision, but the fact that installing the motherboard in this case was so much easier really does just makes life so much easier, because you don't want to be stressing out during that part of the install. But just know going into building in this particular case, you're not going to get a fan controller. You do not have a cutout on the motherboard tray, so make sure you do your CPU cooler install before you mount the motherboard. And don't try to put a GPU or anything that's too big in here, because the airflow is not going to be wonderful and you're not going to have a great deal of clearance within the case. So just make sure you read the specs and understand them before you start selecting components. I think it's a nice looking case. It's very compact. It's light, but it feels sturdy once you get the build complete, and I do like the really clean look. I also was able to tuck some of the cables up above the optical drive since the power supply does mount at the top, and I think that was kind of a good plan on this one since there's no cable management around the back. It does give you a little bit of room to hide some of those cables up there as well as behind that hard drive tray. If you enjoyed this video, you know the drill. Please go ahead and click on that subscribe button. You can also follow me on Twitter over at Tech Uploaded, and you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/Tech Uploaded. And then, of course, you can always hit me up on the Gmail at techuploaded@gmail.com. You know the drill. Don't be a stranger. Check back soon.